This is a video for dissection of the heart, but first we'll talk about flow of blood through the heart. First, as you look at the heart, you should orient it with the apex facing down and to the left. We have going from left to right, so this is the left atrium right here, this auricle. This is the right atrium here, and inside of these chambers you see pectinate muscles making up those walls, and this chamber also would be lined with simple squamous epithelia called endocardium. Above these flaps, or medial to these flaps, both of them, you have the pulmonary trunk here. The pulmonary trunk is going to be the anterior and leftmost vessel on the top part of the heart as our landmark. So as we dissect in a moment, we're going to see that that is our first line of placement for the wooden probe and our first cut down into the right ventricle that we see here. So this is the pulmonary trunk, off of which the pulmonary arteries go into the lungs and the pulmonary circuit for oxygenation of the blood at the respiratory membrane and return of that blood through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Just right of that, or also on the top of the heart, the thick vessel that we see here is the ascending aorta, or the aorta. The aorta passes beneath the pulmonary trunk and then goes up, and as it's the ascending aorta, goes behind the heart as the thoracic aorta, and then as it descends below the diaphragm becomes the abdominal aorta and supplies with about 2/3 of the body's blood all of the internal organs and extremities down below. So we have pulmonary trunk, we have the aorta, which is a very thick-walled structure, and there's 3 branches coming off of it. We'll do those later. The branches later. This is the brachiocephalic trunk, the right side. It would have the common carotid and the subclavian coming off of it. And then right off of the aorta on the left side, we have the left common carotid and left subclavian. So pulmonary trunk, aorta, and then furthest to the right, above the right atrium that we just identified, would be the superior vena cava. That's being fed and draining the superior part of the head and neck region of the body. As we look at this right atrium over here, and these landmarks, below this, the superior vena cava, we would have the right atrium that it's dumping into. This also has 3 other things that dump back into the right atrium, and it would be, of course, the inferior vena cava, draining the lower extremities, okay, and the inferior vena cava. In addition to superior and inferior, we have the coronary sinus on the back side. This large vessel is collecting blood that's in the heart muscle itself, delivered to the heart, and now returning into that coronary sinus. The 4th thing is a single vessel, also returning from coronary flow, and this is the sequence of coronary flow that we see right here. Okay, and this sequence of coronary flow is going to be a pathway of blood supply to the heart and then return back. And if you notice, this single vessel is the only one from coronary flow that doesn't return its blood into the coronary sinus and into the right atrium, and it would be the anterior cardiac vein. This would be that anterior cardiac vein right here by itself returning blood into the right atrium. So one more time, the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, the coronary sinus from the heart itself, and the anterior cardiac vein are the major blood return pathways into the right atrium. This deoxygenated blood is now going to pass from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve that we see here, or the right AV valve, atrioventricular valve, and as it passes in, or as contraction occurs because of SA node initiation and conduction, you're going to find that this valve is going to control movement from right atrium into the right ventricle. As the blood's delivered from the right ventricle out of the body, it's going to be going through the pulmonary semilunar valve, into this pulmonary trunk, through the pulmonary arteries, which are, by the way, the only arteries that are carrying deoxygenated blood in the body. And that pulmonary circuit is going to then oxygenate the blood. And as the blood is oxygenated, you will find that you would have pulmonary veins from either side following oxygenation at the respiratory membrane, oxygenated blood traveling through these pulmonary veins here and here would return into the left atrium, and the left atrium's blood will then build up pressure, and you would have a movement of blood through the bicuspid valve, the left AV valve, or the mitral valve that we see here, anchored by these papillary muscles and innervated by Purkinje fibers from the conduction system, bringing blood into that thickest portion of the heart and the left atrium, left ventricle. Sorry, the left ventricle is going to have within it a much thicker, striated, fenestrated type of muscle, and this is referred to as the trabeculate carne. Remember, in the atrium, we saw that was the musculate pectinate or pectinate muscles, a different type of muscle with regard to function. This right here would be the interventricular septum, along which we're going to see this left coronary artery. Here's the right coronary artery, and the branches that come off of that. We'll do those branches later. So as blood is returned into the left atrium and then down into the left ventricle, this is the thickest portion of the heart, and this is what will deliver the blood through the through the aortic semilunar valve, you see through there, into the systemic circuit and coronary pathways, coronary circulation as well. The contraction of this ventricle with the other ventricle is going to result in movement of blood and forcing of the blood through that aortic semilunar valve and out to, as I said, coronary and systemic flow. The heart is selfish, and it takes the best blood for itself right away that's oxygenated, and it's going to send it out to the muscle of the myocardium of the heart through the right coronary artery and left coronary arteries that we see here and all their associated branches. As we looked at the actual heart and did the dissection on this, the four pathways or cuts that were used for this dissection would be in order. First, we orient ourselves with the apex of the heart here. We have here the interventricular septum, and so that sort of vertical or diagonal arrangement is very different from the fat-embedded coronary sinus that's horizontal on the back side of the heart. So this would be posterior, and this is the anterior view of the heart. So what we did was we had three vessels on the top of the heart here. Here's the pulmonary trunk, anterior and leftmost vessel. And then as we look here, this would be the aorta, the thickest vessel. That's just posterior and right of that structure on the heart. And then we have the superior vena cava going into the right atrium and down through the tricuspid valve over here. The last cut that another cut we're going to do is through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, down through the bicuspid, and deep into the left ventricle of the heart on a posterior cut. So there will be two anterior cuts and two posterior cuts that we're going to be using here. The first anterior cut is through the pulmonary trunk, down through the pulmonary semilunar valve, and then deep into that chamber that is the right ventricle. So this first cut over here is going to be right here, down through this vessel, the pulmonary trunk, through the pulmonary semilunar valve, and then deep into the right ventricle, and we'll open this up as an anterior cut on the heart. Okay, the second cut is going to be down also on the right side through the superior vena cava. We cut open the ventricle here, and then we moved it through and down into the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle as well, along this angle here, and deep into that chamber. So the pulmonary trunk cut will be an anterior cut, and the tricuspid valve pathway and through the right atrium will be a posterior cut that'll be made. The third cut that we're making is a posterior cut as well. It's through the pulmonary vein, and this pulmonary vein will lead into right here into the ventricle, into the left atrium, and through the left atrium, if we lift this probe and move it through the bicuspid deep into that chamber, we'll be cutting the backside of the left ventricle through the left atrium. The final cut will be through this top thickest vessel that's in between superior vena cava and the pulmonary trunk, and that cut will be through the aorta, down through the aortic semilunar valve, and as we head through that semilunar valve, we will be heading it deep into the left atrium, left ventricle on the way there. So the left ventricle, okay, there we go, deep into that chamber will be the other anterior cut. So review would be pulmonary trunk, anterior, right side of the heart to the ventricle. then superior vena cava down into through the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle posterior side. On this other side, we go through the left atrium, through the pulmonary vein, down through the bicuspid valve, and deep into a posterior cut of the left side of the heart. Okay, and then the last cut would be through this middle pathway, which is the thickest vessel, and that thickest vessel would be the aorta, down through the aortic semilunar valve, and then deep into that chamber on an anterior pathway into the left ventricle. Okay, those cuts have been made now, and we see the same arrangement. Here's the first cut that we described through the pulmonary trunk down into the right ventricle. We can see here that the valve that we passed through as we cut down, descended down the heart, is this three-piece valve. That's the pulmonary semilunar valve. There's the three pieces that would circularly control the flow of blood out to the pulmonary circuit. Here's the thinner walled right ventricular wall, and this would be the moderator band stabilizing that wall for contraction. On the apex down here, we can see some Purkinje fibers right here that are going to be innervating the papillary muscles and the apex of the heart down below. The second cut opened up the backside of the heart through the superior vena cava, and here we can see a nice view of the tricuspid valve. Okay, and that tricuspid valve is going to be also referred to as the right AV valve. So this is the ventricle below it. Here's the pectinate muscles right up here that we see in the atrium right there, and down below the trabeculae carneae and the thicker portion of the muscle in the ventricular wall. The next cut would be this cut down in through the pulmonary vein. This is the left atrium here. So there would be the pulmonary veins dumping into that, and then here you see a nice view of the thick left side of the heart, the left ventricle. This would be a papillary muscle attached to the chordae tendineae right here. That would then attach to the bicuspid mitral or left AV valve above it, and help control the movement of blood from the left atrium down into the left ventricle. Finally, as blood is dispelled from that left ventricle and out through, this is another view of the chordae tendineae right here in the bicuspid valve, and this is the aorta deep right there. And so these little flaps, like we saw on the other side of the heart, the flaps there would be the aorta semilunar valve portions that control blood out into the systemic flow. So those are the four major cuts. Real quick, this is the opening into the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve and the pulmonary trunk. Here's the back side of that through the superior vena cava down into that chamber, into the right ventricle. Here's the left ventricle and left atrium and the bicuspid or mitral valve. And then on the anterior view through the aorta and down into the left ventricle, the thickest trabeculae carneae portion there. And you can see some Purkinje fibers innervating deep in this area, and this is the thickest part of the heart going through this aortic semilunar valve here into the systemic flow and coronary circuits.